Hello Aqua friends, welcome to my channel. My name is Nicole and today I have my favorite bird, which is this beautiful Cardinal. And the reference photo that I'm using is from Unsplash. It is a lovely head-on view of this beautiful bird and he's super fluffy, and so I decided to do him wet on wet. I've been practicing a lot of wet on wet and really getting to know my watercolor papers and my brushes. And I've been spending a lot of the holidays practicing, and I can't wait to show you what I learned. I'm going to be using big brushes to paint this bird. I blew them up so that I have them on a 9x12 piece of Arches watercolor paper. The secret to wet on wet is to really, really wet your paper really well, like taking the time and doing it for a good 3 to 4 minutes, even letting that soak in a little bit and coming back and re-wetting the area. Your paper will actually start to buckle a little bit. As you can see, my paper is quite saturated and it's starting to buckle on the belly there a little bit. I don't want it like super warped, because then, you know, your paper, your colors are gonna kind of pool into those divots, and I don't want that. But has to be pretty wet so that you have time to put your colors in. Now that is the thing with watercolors, it's your paper's constantly drying, right? From the time that you finished wetting the whole thing, where you end up, the beginning of your paper is starting to dry. And so we do need to use a big brush as key to getting in all your colors. Now I am going over my lines on the side of the bird because I do want a spill of color coming off of the edges there. Because if you notice in the reference photo, he's kind of backlit and he's got a lot of warmth to him. So my plan is to use all those really nice warm undertones and get those in as a base color. So pretty much ready to go here. I've really wet him well. I want to make sure that I'm not missing any areas, and I don't want to go over the eyeballs, and so I'm trying to work around that area. You could also tilt your paper and you can see it glistening. You can see if you have any pools of puddles, because you don't want puddles. So you could tilt it, have a look at it, and see if you're ready to go. And of course, I'm always going to start with the lightest colors. In my palette, I have some cadmium yellow, and I also have a very rich, warm yellow from Daniel Smith. And that one's called Aussie Red Gold. And it's a very beautiful saturated yellow. So notice I'm not putting the yellow everywhere. I'm skipping some areas and I'm trying to just go where I see a lot of the warmth of the bird. And as we work around the bird like this, and we're not just concentrating on one area, when you're putting paint down, you're also putting moisture down. So working around that wet area is going to keep your paper wet longer. So now I'm picking up a warm red. This is like a pyrrole red or scarlet red in my palette here. So I'm picking some of that up, mixing it with my yellow a little bit, so that I could start shaping this bird and getting those reds in. And notice I'm always stroking and painting in the direction that the feathers are growing. So I really need to work back up on the top of his head here. and get those red feathers in because my paper is going to start to dry. And noticing by using the red and the yellow separately like this and layering them on there, all the mixing is kind of being done on the paper, and you'll always get a very more vibrant and like pretty result instead of mixing the colors in the palette. Because watercolor's transparent, they're gonna kind of mingle on the paper, and they'll be so much more prettier. So trying to get that really red parts in. I will have to go over his face area with some really dark browns, and I'll show you the colors that I mix for that. But yeah, getting in a good amount of the red here. He's really starting to shape up. You do want to use a large brush to paint the bird. If you blow up your bird like this and you're painting a large area, you'll have more time using the proper size brush. If I was to use a little brush, I would never be able to get all these colors in before my paper dries. So that's a huge tip for you guys. Make sure you use the right size paintbrush. Now, I could have switched to a very large round mop brush, or a round brush, a mop brush, quill brush, whatever you want to call them. But I just kept with my flat brush because I could angle it, and I could still get into all those nooks and crannies using the same brush. So now I'm going to pick up my blue, and I have to start adding in some of these darker shadow colors. So of course, underneath his breast, there's going to be shadows because he's leaning on that tree branch. And without shadows, then there will be no shape to our bird. So you really do have to get those colors in. And notice I'm just grabbing that blue. I'm not really mixing it on the palette. I'm going to let it do its job on the paper. Again, painting in the direction that all those feathers are going. And I'm trying to go underneath his beak there, and kind of drawing a little bit of a map of where these dark colors are going. So here I go with the dark colors. I have some sepia mixed with neutral tint, and I never cleaned my brush because I already have a lot of dark colors on there. So I'm just going to go for that really thick paint. Now, another thing I want to mention is because your paper, you spent all that time really saturating your paper. Notice that the mixture of my paints in the palette are very thick. I don't have a lot of water there. We don't need a lot of water because we have water on our paper. And so you do want to use a thicker consistency of paint when you're doing this wet on wet technique. Now my paper's starting to dry. I'm getting some more defined brush strokes here. So I am running out of time. I'm going to go for some more of this really thick consistency and get those really dark colors in on his face that need to happen here. Now it's a little hard to get into those nooks and crannies, so I have switched to a mop brush, and I'm going to paint in those dark colors. As you can see, it also extends around the eye, so I'm trying to get that in as well. But I'm staying away from the beak and the eye itself, because everything's wet. I want those areas to be detailed because everything is soft. You need some sort of contrast, and I don't want the whole bird to be blurry. So those areas, the beak and the eyes, will be done once our paper dries completely. So it's looking pretty good. The black area is spreading nicely because it's still wet there. Now here's my major trick, guys. You want to use a dry, fluffy brush. This is a hacky brush. And while your paper still has a little bit of sheen to it, or even if it's lost its sheen, as long as you don't wait too long, you can further manipulate the colors and really smooth them out by using a fluffy brush. So that's what I was doing there, just to blend them a little bit more. So now that I've lost the sheen of my paper, now's a good time to do any lifting. And I have done this before on a lot of my animals. You take a script liner brush and it has to be damp, but you always have to dab off the excess moisture. So I always have my script liner brush and a piece of paper towel in the other hand. And when you make some marks for some feathers here and there, it'll lift up the paint. As you can see, you're getting some effects of some feathers. Now, obviously, I don't want to go around the whole bird and do it everywhere because then it's going to lose its charm. So less is more in this technique. I mean, you don't have to do this step at all if you just like him really fuzzy and you don't want any individual little feathers peeking through. You don't need, you could skip that step. So while the main bird is drying, there is a little tip of his wing in the back here that I could go ahead and do wet on wet. So I just have some very watery consistency of a gray here for the tip of his wing. And just dipping in with the colors I've already mixed up on my palette to get the shadows and some shape of some of the feathers here. Adding in some darker colors. It's still wet, so those individual groups of feathers that I'm drawing in with the tip of my brush, they will soften because I am still working wet on wet. Okay, so I'm going to continue to paint as much as I can. And since he's sitting on this branch here, I could go ahead and start those tail feathers. And I'm always going to be working the same way, starting with my lightest colors and building my colors up. Now, his tail is desaturated a lot, so I will be adding some contrasting colors to desaturate what I put down a little bit, but I do want some of the reds that are right next to the branch really do shine through as a pop of red color there. So I am going ahead and adding in those highly pigmented colors. And then coming in, picking up those more desaturated colors and adding that in while everything is nice and wet. Picking up a darker mixture of these desaturated colors to define some of these feathers. So I'm pretty happy with the way that's looking, and I'm gonna let everything dry now. Now that everything's dry, I'm gonna add a little bit of gray to that tip. The reason why I didn't add this gray to the tip of this wing in the first layer is because that part was already drying, and I didn't want to make a bloom. So not a big deal. I'm just re-wetting that area to add in a little bit of gray in that tip. And now we're going to work on the face of the cardinal. Everything else about him is done. So this was basically a one layer painting. I'm not going to put another layer on him. I'm just going to get the eyes, all the details in the eyes and the beak, and he'll be finished. So getting a little sparkle in the eyes, I decided to do an underpainting of the blue, same blue that I'm using. There is a lighter ring around each eye. Basically the eyelids of the bird, and I am spending quite a bit of time with a very small little flat brush here, and it's damp, and I just want to pull up some of the color around the eye so that I do have that lighter area for the eyelids. I'm going to draw that very dark black that I see, and I'm using a mixture of my sepia and neutral tint. It's the same mixture that I used to paint his face. So continuing to look at your reference photo and seeing where you need to outline the areas of his eyes. The brush that I'm using, this mop brush, has a very fine point. It is a pretty big brush though, so if your paintbrushes don't have a fine point to them like this, you might want to change to a smaller brush. So taking some of that gray mixture and adding that on the eye itself and leaving a tiny sliver where the highlight of his eye is. Now that I worked on that eye, I'm going to go ahead and switch over and do the other eye. Now, because I'm left-handed, I'm working from the right side of my canvas to the left. So if you're right-handed, you would do this eye first and then do the other eye. So pretty happy with that. While that layer on his eyes dry, I'm going to go ahead and start wetting the beak area. So for the beak, I am going to use some quinacridone red. Now the very tip of the beak does have some neutral colors on there, so since I have some of that neutral color that I mixed up on my palette, I'm just going to use that to outline the beak area and pull up some of these gray colors on his beak. So basically you're kind of like using just the tip of your brush and using it like you're drawing or, you know, sketching in a way. Re-wetting my quinacridone red there because it's drying out. I am going to put a thicker consistency of this pink color on his beak. Now it's darker on the sides and lighter in the middle, and that's going to give his beak dimension. If we just painted it all one color and one shade, then you wouldn't get the 3D effect. It would look very flat. So grabbing some of my warm red the pyrrole or the scarlet red that I have in my palette there. I'm adding that to the sides where the saturation on the beak is the greatest. So I'm just moving the colors around, getting them to flow in the direction that I want, and I'm going to let that whole thing dry. So going back to the eyes, they're not dark enough, and I am going to add another layer of paint here. Lifting around where the eyelid is. So remember, when you're lifting, you're going to be using a damp brush. Having a stiffer brush works, and for little tiny areas like trying to get the eyelids lighter, I think that a small flat brush works really well. So coming in with my thick dark mixture of the sepia and neutral tint, I'm getting that really dark area on his eye. I have switched to a size 4 round brush because I'm working in a very tight area here. So notice I always have a piece of paper towel in my hand. So the trick is to always adjusting the wetness of your brush. If you want the paint to be darker and to be able to blend it out, your brush needs to be on the drier side. And that just comes from practice and getting to know how much moisture your paper needs, which brushes work the best. I've actually been practicing birds a lot, and I have some calligraphy brushes that I love to use to make animals because you can separate the bristles and get some really cool dry brushing effects. But I was shocked at the difference in the vibrancy of trying a wash with an all natural bristle brush and a wash with a synthetic brush. The synthetic brush was actually a lot more vibrant. And the big mop brush that I used, well, actually, it was a flat brush that I used for getting all the colors on my bird, was a synthetic brush. And for one layer, to get that one layer of paint on, he's pretty handsome just with the one layer painting. So I do feel like I need to increase the saturation of the darkness around his face a little bit. And also, he's very red under the beak. And I'm going to add that in there. So I wet the area where I'm going to add the color. And I'm going in there with full on scarlet red and just getting that really warm red under there. And that's really, really popping. Now I'm not going to rinse off my brush. I'm just going to go for the dark colors of the sepia and the neutral tint. And I'm just going to dab that as close to the beak as I can. I don't want to like redo the whole face because I do want just this one layer is fine. I just needed a little bit extra contrast here. Okay, so I'm pulling that color out in the direction that the feathers are growing. I'm going to add a little bit more red. If it's too strong, you could always blot some paint off like I'm doing with a piece of paper towel. I'm just looking for a good balance here. So on my piece of scrap of watercolor paper, I'm just trying to figure out which one is burnt sienna because I'm going to be working on the branch next, and I love to use the burnt sienna with the blues because they're contrasting colors. It will make its own gray on the paper, and it'll be so much prettier than if we just use a solid gray from the tube. So working the branch wet on wet, I'm going to wet my whole branch area here. And the same thing with the bird. This isn't as big of an area, so I don't have to go over it too many times. The surface area of that branch is not much, so I'm going to give it a good wetness, but I'm not going to go too crazy. So coming in with my blues, and I'm not going to put it everywhere, but I am going to put some here and there, leave some areas, and then right away, not wetting my brush, I'm just going to pick up that burnt sienna and let those colors start to mingle on the paper. So where I didn't put the blue, I'm adding in the burnt sienna and some of the neutral tint and the sepia that I have. So I'm varying up the colors. I'm always grabbing some more colors without rinsing off my brush so that I have these different transitions happening on the paper. Now this branch is quite textured, so as my paper starts to dry, I want to start dabbing the paint on in a manner that's going to sort of mimic those textures a little bit. So keeping an eye on my reference photo. Now when you want more paint, notice that I am pushing down on the belly of the brush more. You will release more pigment that way. If you want fine details, you could just use the very end of your brush. And always I'm working with paint that is a pretty thick consistency. It's not very watery at all because we have the water on the paper. Notice my paper is still shiny. I have still plenty of time to add as many textures as I want to this branch. And it's still wet because I'm constantly going over the whole area. I'm not just concentrating on one spot. I'm moving around that branch, and so it continually stays nice and wet. So I'm adding some little stippling textures here with my thick paint. And as your paper is drying, you'll be able to see how it's settling on the paper if you need to add anything else. Now I want to do what I call controlled blooms. So it's basically the same thing as we did when we lift the feathers, but I'm just doing tiny little dots with a damp brush. This will produce tiny little lighter areas, and it just gives the branch more texture. So I'm just doing that here and there. And I really like the way that this branch is turning out. Now, he is perched on this branch, and while the paper is still damp, I can lift out the claws. So that is what I'm doing here, lifting out his little toes. Because once the branch dries, that'll be the last thing that we have to do, is just paint his claws here. So you're using a damp brush, and each time I'm wiping it off on a piece of paper towel. Last claw. All right, we're gonna let that whole thing dry now. And now that everything's dry, I'm gonna put the colors in for his claws. I'm gonna pre-wet his feet. And there's quite a purpley hue to his skin here, so I'll be mixing in my reds and blues together. The underside of his toes is going to have a lot more shadow, and so I'm going to darken up those areas. And add some of those wrinkles that I can see in the reference photo. Reshaping that one area because it's like two toes kind of together, and I had to reshape that part. Coming in the home stretch here, folks, using my darkest colors to do the underside of these claws. And then you guys can sign your painting. You just created a masterpiece. Congratulations. Hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know if you're going to give it a try, and I'll see you guys next time.